Okay, let's do some of our ratios now. We covered some of this in class. Remember I told you that one of the best approaches you can take to this, at least at first, is to memorize it and practice it until it makes sense. Let's look first at the leverage ratio. If you remember from your book and lecture, the leverage ratio is the total assets, right, over the total stockholders' equity. So a couple of things I want you to notice here. Notice that when you click and view the financial information for Great Deal and for Best Stores, I want you to notice something that might save you some time and grief on test day. Notice that it's giving you the total assets, equity, operating, it's giving you some different information. Of course, it doesn't give you this because it's asking you this, but it gives you this information. If you will look at this information, it's a copy of what's here. When you have this basically here, just close that. You don't need it, right? You don't need to have it up here looking at it twice and being in the way. I mean, it's basically the exact same thing you've got here. So that's helpful. And you've got the information there in front of you. You don't have to worry about it. So for Great Deal, we've got 16,850 as total assets. Remember, that's going to be our numerator, 16,850. And we're going to divide that by total stockholders' equity. And here it tells you stockholders' equity. Pretty easy, right? That gives you 5.46. So when you come over here and put 5.46, round your answer to 2 decimal places. So it's even telling you what it wants you to do. I've got 5.461, so we're going to keep it at 546. And you do the exact same thing for Best Store. You've got total assets, and you divide it by total stockholders' equity, and you have your answer. 203,150 divided by 72,100 gives you 2.817. 2.817. We're going to round to that seconds place, so we're going to bump that up to 2. All right, now let's look at total debt. One of the things that will happen on test day if you get a problem like this is it'll ask you for total debt and you'll completely freak out because you'll go debt. Okay, that's payables. So that's my notes payable, my bonds payable. And you'll look and you look and you go, man, I don't see anything here. Then you'll click here and you'll go, where's my payables? Where's my payables? I don't understand. How do I get to the amounts that the company owes? Please don't panic. Remember when you see total debt, remember the accounting equation. The accounting equation is total assets equals liabilities plus stockholders' equity. Well, this problem gives you total assets. And it gives you, so you've got that, and you're trying to get this, right? You don't know what this is, but it gives you this, total stockholders' equity, right there. So basically, to get total debt, you just subtract stockholders' equity, right? If you take total assets and subtract this minus that has to equal the liabilities. So you just back into it. Nothing to panic about. So we're going to take 16,850 and we're going to subtract stockholders' equity of 3,085, and that gives us 13,765. We're going to do the same thing for Best Stores. Take 203,150 total assets minus 72,100. We get 131,050. If I could type. 131,050. And all I did was just take for each of the companies, the total assets minus the stockholders' equity, assets minus stockholders' equity, you backs into total liabilities. Now let's look and compute the debt ratio. Let's look at debt ratio. Debt ratio, if you'll recall from your book and lectures, defined as total liabilities divided by total assets. What the debt ratio is trying to identify, like for example here, we're trying to see how many assets does the company have to cover a certain amount of stockholders' equity. Generally speaking, what you want is you want the assets to be high in relation to stockholders' equity. Here on the debt ratio, they're looking at your liabilities and they're saying how much assets are backing up those total liabilities. Obviously, if you have a whole bunch of debt and very, very, very small total assets, that's something that's alarming. if for every single dollar of liability you have a dollar of assets, that's more comforting. And this is one of the things you're trying to identify with the debt ratio. So let's look at, you can see we've been kind of building it here because you've got total debt over total assets. Here you have total debt. Here you have total assets. This you just backed into. So now it's just a matter of working with what you've built. You've got 13,765 divided by 16850, and that gives you 0.816. We're going to go ahead and round to the nearest 2 digits, so we'll bump that up to 2. And now we're back into 2 decimal points. Same way here, we got total debt of 131,050, and we're going to divide it by total assets of 203,150. That gives us 0.645. However, we're going to take it to 2 decimal points. So we will, if it's a 5, you bump it up. So we'll go to 5. And that gives us our debt ratio. If you look carefully here, remember what we're looking at here. We're looking at amount of debt to assets, right? So what we're looking at is we're looking at for this debt, right? For this amount of debt, we have this many assets to cover it. Okay, and for this amount of debt, we have this many assets to cover it. So be mindful, the higher this gets, the higher that the assets get, the lower the debt ratio is. If as assets go down, then that makes this debt ratio go up. Let's look at times earned interest. If you remember, times earned interest ratio is operating income divided by interest expense. One of the things that this type of analysis is trying to indicate how much operating income do you have to cover interest expense. If you have very, very little operating income and you have tons and tons of interest expense, you owe lots of money, that's generally viewed as negative. If you have lots of ample operating income to cover your interest, it's perceived as something that's good. So again, here we pretty much have everything laid out. As long as you've got your formula, it's operating income divided by interest expense. Here we have operating income, which is 1095. And remember, we're going to take operating income over interest expense. Right here, divided by 140. That gives us 7.821, but we're going to go ahead and round to 2, so we'll just go ahead and get rid of that 1. We will not take the 2 up to a 3. Again, on this next one, we'll do the same thing. Operating income over interest expense, 25980, divided by 2060. That gives us 1.26. Oops, excuse me, wrong number. 12.611. We're rounding off to 2 to the right of the digit, so we're going to go ahead and just prune off that 1 and not make that as 1262. Here you can see, our good one here is operating income. So right off the bat, this is going to be better because you've got basically more operating income to cover a given interest expense. Keep in mind the directional benefit of these different ratios. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you come over here to leverage ratio, one of the things you should keep in mind is you want your leverage ratio to be as low as possible. Okay, you want assets ideally to be created by turned into cash from net income. You ideally want assets to come about because the company is doing really well, not because it's floating a whole bunch of stock and creating cash that way. So total assets are good. You want this number to be high. The problem is you don't want it to be high relative to stockholders' equity. So generally speaking, leverage ratio, you want it to be as low as possible. And a company that has a high leverage ratio means a lot of these assets are covered by Stockholders Equity. Debt ratio. You want debt ratio to be as low as possible. You want very few liabilities and tons of assets, and that creates a very small number, and that's what you want. When you come to times interest earned, there's a switch, because when you come here, you want the number to be as high as possible. The reason you want it to be high is you want operating income to be really high relative to interest and expense. So when it's comparing these two companies, Great Deal and Best Stores, what you notice right off the bat is that Great Deal, when you focus on leverage ratio, its leverage ratio is higher. Remember, we want it to be lower. And the debt ratio is higher too, 0.82 versus 0.65. Again, you want these numbers, right, for both these companies, assuming you're investing in both, to be as low as possible. Then when you flip over to the times interest earned ratio, you notice that it flip-flops, and Best Store has a high interest ratio, times interest earned ratio. And here, what we want it to be as high as possible. Again, Great Deal is on the wrong side of this. Great Deal not only has the leverage ratio and the debt ratio higher, which they would want it to be lower, but then the one they want to be higher is lower, which is that last one, times interest earned. So what you can conclude from these numbers is that Great Deals, this company right here, their ability to pay debt is weaker than Best's. So if you're an investor and you want a company that is, quote, stronger, Best Store would be your best bet. I hope you found this useful.